What if I told you that the version of American history you learned in school was just the highlight reel, the sanitized PG-13 version carefully curated to make you feel warm and fuzzy about the land of the free? But underneath the surface, buried deep in dusty archives and redacted government files, there are stories. Stories so strange, so dark, so utterly insane, they sound like they were ripped from a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. But they're real, and tonight we're digging them up. Alright folks, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. It's your friendly neighborhood history nerd here to ruin your blissful ignorance once again. Tonight we're not talking about George Washington's wooden teeth or Paul Revere's midnight ride. No, we're going deeper. We're diving into the nitty-gritty, the unvarnished truth. We have 4 stories for you. 4 American secrets that powerful people tried very, very hard to bury. Some for over 100 years. We're talking about a secret plot by Wall Street billionaires to overthrow the president. Picture this. It's 1933. The country is bleeding from the Great Depression, and a group of America's wealthiest men are sitting in smoke-filled rooms not discussing stock portfolios, but planning an actual military coup. They wanted to raise a private army of 500,000 veterans and march them straight to Washington. This isn't some Hollywood fever dream, this actually happened. We're talking about young women who literally glowed in the dark before their bodies fell apart. These weren't supernatural beings or science fiction characters. These were real girls, teenagers, and young women in their 20s who went to work every day painting watch dials with a substance that made them shine like living nightlights. They thought it was magical. They had no idea they were painting themselves to death one brushstroke at a time. We're talking about a government experiment that lasted 40 years, built on a foundation of lies so monstrous it would make Dr. Mengele blush. The United States Public Health Service convinced hundreds of poor black men in rural Alabama that they were receiving free health care. Instead, they were guinea pigs in a study designed to watch syphilis slowly destroy their bodies, minds, and lives. Even when a cure was discovered, these men were deliberately denied treatment, all in the name of science. And we're talking about a secret war the FBI waged not against foreign spies or international terrorists, but against its own citizens. American citizens whose only crime was thinking differently, speaking out, or daring to challenge the status quo. The FBI created an entire shadow operation dedicated to destroying the lives of civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and anyone else J. Edgar Hoover deemed a threat to his vision of America. These aren't conspiracy theories. These aren't urban legends passed down through internet forums. These are documented historical facts backed by government records, court documents, and congressional investigations. The only reason we know about them is because brave individuals risked everything to expose the truth. You see, the thing about power is that it always thinks it knows what's best for everyone else. Whether it's corporate executives deciding that a little radiation never hurt anyone, government officials concluding that poor black men don't deserve medical treatment, or federal agents believing that American citizens exercising their constitutional rights are enemies of the state power corrupt. And when power operates in secret, when it hides behind classified stamps and corporate lawyers, that corruption becomes monstrous. But here's what makes these stories even more fascinating. They're not ancient history. The business plot happened during your grandparents' lifetime. The Radium girls were fighting for worker safety when your great-grandmother might have been entering the workforce. The Tuskegee study was still active when your parents were born. COINTELPRO was destroying lives when the Beatles were topping the charts. These secrets shaped the America we live in today. The labor safety regulations that protect workers, the medical ethics boards that oversee human experimentation, the congressional oversight of intelligence agencies. All of these exist because of the horrors you're about to hear. So, go ahead, dim those lights, find your comfy spot, and maybe grab a drink. This is going to be a long one. We're settling in for the night. Get comfortable, because once we start pulling on these threads, you're going to see American history in a completely different light. And hey, while you're getting cozy, if you're the kind of person who digs this kind of stuff, the real story behind the story, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button, maybe even the bell. It just tells the YouTube gods that we, the late night history crew, appreciate the truth no matter how uncomfortable it is. Only if you're into it, of course. You know what I love about doing these deep dives? It's not the shock value, though. There's plenty of that. It's the reminder that history isn't some distant abstract thing that happened to other people in other times. History is a living, breathing force that shaped every institution, every law, every social norm we take for granted today. When you walk into a workplace and see safety regulations posted on the wall, you're looking at the legacy of the Radium girls. When you hear about informed consent in medical procedures, you're witnessing the aftermath of Tuskegee. When you debate government surveillance programs, you're grappling with the ghost of COINTELPRO. When you see congressional hearings investigating corporate malfeasance, you're watching the echoes of the business plot. These stories matter because they reveal something fundamental about power. It never gives up its secrets willingly. Every single one of these conspiracies was exposed not because the perpetrators grew a conscience, but because individuals chose to risk everything for the truth. A decorated Marine general who could have lived comfortably on his military pension, but instead chose to blow the whistle on a fascist plot. Factory workers who were literally dying, but refused to stay silent about corporate negligence. A government employee who threw away his career to expose medical atrocities. Anti-war activists who broke into an FBI office because they knew American citizens were being targeted by their own government. That's the pattern you'll notice. As we go through these stories, the truth only emerges when ordinary people do extraordinary things. Not because they're heroes or saints, but because they reach a point where staying silent becomes impossible. Ready, good. Because our first secret takes us back to a time when the country was on its knees and a group of the wealthiest men in America decided the only solution was a military coup. A coup that came within a whisper of succeeding, and the only thing that stopped it was one man's integrity. Let's start there. Picture America in 1933. Not the America of Hollywood glamour or jazz age prosperity, but the real America. The broken America. The America where 1 in 4 workers had no job. Where families lived in cardboard shacks they called Hoovervilles, where farmers watched their crops wither while people starved in cities just miles away. Imagine walking through any major city in 1933. The smell hits you first. Unwashed bodies, rotting garbage, the acrid smoke from burning trash in metal drums. Bread lines stretch around city blocks filled with men in threadbare suits who used to be bank managers, factory foremen, shop owners. Men who once considered themselves middle class now stand with their hats in their hands, waiting for a bowl of watery soup and a stale piece of bread. The Great Depression didn't just destroy the economy, it shattered the American psyche. This was supposed to be the land of opportunity, the place where hard work guaranteed success. But hard work meant nothing when there was no work to be had. The American dream hadn't just died, it had been revealed as a cruel joke. Into this nightmare walked Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man from one of America's most privileged families who somehow understood the desperation of ordinary people better than politicians who had grown up poor. FDR's New Deal wasn't just a collection of government programs, it was a fundamental reimagining of what government could and should do for its citizens. But here's what they don't teach you in school. Not everyone was thrilled about FDR's plans to save American capitalism from itself. The people who owned that capitalism, the titans of industry and finance who had profited enormously from the system that had just collapsed, saw Roosevelt not as a savior, but as a traitor to his class. To understand their rage, you need to understand who these men were. We're not talking about your garden variety rich guys. We're talking about men who controlled entire industries, who could manipulate stock prices with a phone call, who owned newspapers and radio stations and politicians. Men like the DuPont family who had made fortunes from chemicals and explosives, the Pew family who controlled Sun Oil, J.P. Morgan Jr., heir to the banking empire that had essentially been America's central bank before the Federal Reserve existed. These weren't just wealthy individuals, they were an interconnected network of corporate power that had been running America from behind the scenes for decades. They had funded presidential campaigns, influenced legislation, and shaped economic policy to benefit their interests. The idea that some crippled patrician from Hyde Park could waltz into Washington and start regulating their businesses, taxing their profits, and empowering labor unions was absolutely unthinkable. But Roosevelt wasn't just threatening their wallets, he was threatening their worldview. These men believed with religious fervor that unfettered capitalism was not just the best economic system, but the only moral one. They saw government regulation as socialism, worker protections as communism, and social safety nets as the first step towards Soviet-style tyranny. From their perspective, Roosevelt wasn't saving America, he was destroying it. And if the democratic process had produced this socialist monster, then maybe democracy itself needed to be replaced with something more, shall we say, reliable. Now imagine you're in a smoke-filled room in downtown Manhattan in the summer of 1933. The men around the mahogany table aren't discussing stock portfolios or merger deals. They're talking about raising a private army. The conversation might sound surreal today, but to these men, it made perfect sense. Roosevelt had been president for barely 6 months, and already his administration was proposing regulations that would cost them millions. The National Recovery Administration was setting wage and hour standards. The Securities Exchange Commission was being created to regulate Wall Street. Labor unions were being given unprecedented power. Something had to be done. And if the American people were too stupid to recognize the communist threat in their midst, well, perhaps it was time for wiser heads to prevail. The plan they hatched was breathtakingly audacious. They would recruit a prominent military figure to lead a march on Washington with 500,000 veterans. This army wouldn't exactly overthrow Roosevelt. That would be too crude, too obviously fascist. Instead, they would force him to appoint a new position, a Secretary of General Affairs who would handle the day-to-day operations of government, while Roosevelt remained as a figurehead. Think of it as a hostile corporate takeover, but instead of buying up stock, they'd be using armed veterans. Roosevelt would still get to live in the White House and give speeches, but the actual running of the country would be handled by, well, the people who really understood how things worked. It was essentially a soft coup designed to look patriotic rather than treasonous. They would save America from socialism by placing it under the benevolent guidance of its most successful capitalists. What could be more American than that? But they needed a face for their movement. Someone with unimpeachable military credentials and the respect of ordinary Americans. Someone who could rally veterans to the cause and make their coup look like a patriotic rescue mission rather than a power grab. They found their man in Major General Smedley Butler, and choosing him was either the smartest or dumbest decision they ever made. Smedley Butler was by any measure a legitimate American badass. He had enlisted in the Marines at 16 and spent the next 34 years fighting in every corner of the world where American interests needed defending. He had been awarded the Medal of Honor twice, making him one of only 19 men in American history to receive that distinction. He had commanded Marine operations in China, Nicaragua, Mexico, and Haiti. He was the youngest man ever to achieve the rank of Major General. But here's what made Butler dangerous to the conspirators: he had developed a conscience. By 1933, Butler had come to realize that most of his military career had been spent not defending American freedom, but protecting American corporate interests. He had helped United Fruit Company maintain its stranglehold over Central American governments. He had protected banking investments in China and oil interests in Mexico. He had spent 3 decades as what he would later call a racketeer for capitalism. This realization had turned Butler into something the wealthy conspirators apparently didn't expect: an actual patriot who believed in American democratic values more than American business interests. The first approach came from Gerald McGuire, a bond trader connected to the powerful Clark family of Philadelphia. McGuire visited Butler at his home and began with small talk about veteran affairs, but gradually, the conversation turned to the current political situation and the need for strong leadership. McGuire was subtle at first. He talked about the success of fascist movements in Europe, how Mussolini had saved Italy from chaos, how strong leadership was sometimes necessary to preserve democratic values. He mentioned that certain wealthy Americans were concerned about the direction the country was heading and were looking for ways to ensure stability. Butler listened politely but non-committally. He had dealt with enough politicians and business leaders to recognize a recruitment pitch when he heard one. The second meeting was more direct. McGuire brought along Robert Sterling Clark, heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune, and one of the wealthiest men in America. Clark laid out the plan more explicitly. They had financial backing from some of the most prominent families in the country. They could raise an army of 500,000 veterans. All they needed was the right leader, a patriot. They offered Butler the chance to be that leader to save America from the socialist policies that were destroying the country. They painted a picture of Butler as a patriotic general, leading a disciplined army of veterans to restore constitutional government and free market principles. But there was something about the way they talked that made Butler's skin crawl. These men spoke about American workers the way a rancher might talk about cattle, as property to be managed rather than citizens to be served. They discussed democracy as if it were a luxury the country could no longer afford. And then came the third meeting, the one that convinced Butler he was dealing with genuine fascists rather than concerned patriots. McGuire returned from a trip to Europe with detailed reports on how successful the fascist movements had been in Italy and Germany. He spoke admiringly of the discipline and efficiency of these regimes, how they had eliminated the chaos of democratic politics and implemented rational economic policies. He showed Butler photographs of fascist rallies praising the pageantry and the obvious enthusiasm of the crowds. He talked about how American veterans could be organized along similar lines, how the natural hierarchy of military command could be extended to civilian governance. This was when Butler realized these men weren't interested in saving American democracy. They wanted to replace it with American fascism. They wanted him to be their Mussolini, their strong man who would impose order on the chaos of democratic government. Butler made his decision, but instead of rejecting their offer outright, he played along. He wanted to know exactly how deep this conspiracy went, who was involved, and how serious they were about implementing their plan. What he discovered was terrifying. Over the following months, Butler became the conspirators' most trusted confidant, while secretly documenting everything they told him. What emerged was a picture of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American business and finance. The money men behind the plot read like a who's who of American capitalism, the DuPont family whose chemical fortune had made them one of the wealthiest dynasties in the country. John J. Raskob, former chairman of General Motors and a key figure in Democratic Party politics. The Pugh family of Sun Oil. Prescott Bush, grandfather of future President George H.W. Bush, and great-grandfather of George W. Bush, who was deeply involved in Wall Street finance. These weren't cranks or fringe figures. These were men who sat on corporate boards, funded political campaigns, and had direct access to presidents and congressional leaders. When they spoke, Washington listened. Their plan was remarkably detailed. They had studied the successful fascist takeovers in Europe and were prepared to adapt those tactics to American conditions. Rather than the crude violence of a military coup, they would use the veneer of patriotic legitimacy. Butler would lead a march of veterans to Washington ostensibly to demand government action on veteran benefits. Once there, the veterans would establish camps around the Capitol, similar to the bonus army that had occupied Washington the previous year. But unlike the bonus army, this force would be disciplined, well-funded, and armed. The veterans would then demand that Roosevelt appoint a Secretary of General Affairs to handle the administrative functions of government. Roosevelt, faced with 500,000 armed veterans surrounding the White House, would have little choice but to comply. The new secretary would gradually assume more and more executive functions, while Roosevelt was reduced to a ceremonial figurehead. The man they had chosen for this role was General Hugh Johnson, who had been running Roosevelt's National Recovery Administration. Johnson was already implementing policies that looked suspiciously fascist to many observers, with his emphasis on corporate cooperation and government-business partnerships. With the right pressure, they believed Johnson could be convinced to serve as their frontman. But the most chilling aspect of their plan was its financial backing. McGuire casually mentioned that they had secured a war chest of $3 million to fund their operation. In 1933 dollars, that was equivalent to about $60 million today, more than enough to equip and supply a 500,000-man army for months. Where was this money coming from? McGuire was coy about specific donors, but he made it clear that America's wealthiest families were prepared to spend whatever it took to stop Roosevelt's socialist revolution. They saw it as an investment in preserving the capitalist system that had made them rich. The conspiracy had international dimensions as well. Maguire spoke openly about his meetings with European fascist leaders and their willingness to provide tactical advice and potentially military support. He mentioned conversations with representatives of Mussolini's government and suggested that the Italian model of corporate fascism was particularly well suited to American conditions. Butler was stunned by the scope and audacity of the plot. These men were talking about overthrowing the democratically elected government of the United States, and they were discussing it as casually as they might plan a business merger. But what truly horrified Butler was their certainty that ordinary Americans would support their coup. They believed that people were so desperate for economic stability that they would willingly trade democratic freedoms for fascist efficiency. They saw the American people not as citizens with rights, but as a mob that needed to be controlled by their betters. Maguire explained their reasoning with chilling clarity. The American people are ready for a dictator. They're tired of the chaos of democracy. They want someone to take charge and fix things. All we need to do is give them the right leader and the right justification. This was the moment Butler realized he wasn't just being recruited for a political movement. He was being asked to destroy everything he had spent his life defending. These men were asking him to use his military reputation and the trust of American veterans to eliminate American democracy. Butler made his choice. On November 20th, 1934, he walked into a closed session of the House Committee on Un-American Activities and told them everything. Butler's testimony before the McCormick-Dickstein Committee was explosive. For hours, he laid out the entire conspiracy in meticulous detail. He provided names, date-specific conversations, and documentary evidence. He described the plot's financing, its international connections, and its plans for implementation. The committee members were initially skeptical. The idea that some of America's most prominent businessmen were plotting a fascist coup seemed too outrageous to believe. But Butler's reputation for honesty and his detailed knowledge of the conspiracy gradually convinced them. The committee launched a thorough investigation, interviewing other witnesses and examining financial records. What they found confirmed Butler's account. Maguire had indeed traveled to Europe and met with fascist representatives. The financial backing was real. The recruitment of veterans had begun. On February 15, 1935, the committee released its preliminary report. In language that was remarkably direct for a congressional document, they stated, "There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient." In other words, Congress officially confirmed that wealthy Americans had plotted to overthrow the government of the United States. The committee's final report was even more damning. They concluded that the conspiracy was not the fantasy of a paranoid general, but a genuine threat to American democracy that had been thwarted only by Butler's integrity and their own investigation. But here's where the story takes a truly Kafkaesque turn. Despite official confirmation of the plot, virtually nothing happened to the conspirators. The committee had the power to subpoena witnesses and examine documents, but they lacked the authority to bring criminal charges. That responsibility belonged to the Justice Department, which showed remarkably little interest in prosecuting some of the wealthiest men in America for treason. The official explanation was lack of evidence. Despite congressional confirmation of the plot's existence, prosecutors claimed they couldn't prove criminal intent. Apparently, planning to overthrow the government only became illegal when you actually tried to do it. The real reason was simpler: these men were too powerful to prosecute. They owned newspapers, funded political campaigns, and had direct access to the highest levels of government. A prosecution would implicate not just individual conspirators, but an entire network of corporate and political power that extended throughout American society. Instead, the story was quietly buried. The mainstream press, much of which was owned by friends and associates of the conspirators, treated Butler's testimony as the ravings of an attention-seeking military has-been. Editorial pages dismissed the conspiracy as impossible, arguing that such things simply didn't happen in America. The most prominent newspapers ran articles with headlines like "Plot Without Plotters" and "The Cock and Bull Story." They acknowledged that Butler was an honorable man who believed what he was saying, but suggested he had been the victim of an elaborate hoax by publicity-seeking con men. This narrative was so successful that within a few years the business plot had been relegated to the footnotes of history. Textbooks ignored it entirely. When historians mentioned it at all, they treated it as a minor incident involving a few eccentric businessmen and a gullible general. But the conspiracy was real, and its implications were terrifying. For the first time in American history, wealthy Americans had attempted to use their economic power to directly overthrow democratic government. They had been willing to finance an armed rebellion against a president who had been elected by the largest popular margin in decades. Even more disturbing was their motivation. These weren't men driven by ideology or principle. They were motivated by pure self-interest. They were willing to destroy American democracy to protect their profit margins. The failure of the business plot didn't end the threat it represented. The same men who had funded the conspiracy continued to oppose Roosevelt through legal means, financing conservative politicians and anti-New Deal propaganda. They founded think tanks and lobbying organizations dedicated to rolling back government regulation and worker protections. Many of the companies involved in the plot profited enormously from World War II, selling materials to both sides before America entered the war. Prescott Bush's banking connections were so intertwined with Nazi Germany that his assets were seized under the Trading with the Enemy Act in 1942. The conspiracy's failure also established a pattern that would repeat throughout American history. When legal means of controlling government policy proved insufficient, wealthy interests would explore extra-legal alternatives. The business plot was not an aberration. It was a preview of future attempts to subordinate democratic government to corporate power. Take a moment to consider what would have happened if Smedley Butler had said yes. If this genuine American hero had been seduced by their promises or convinced by their arguments. If 500,000 desperate veterans had marched on Washington in 1934, demanding that Roosevelt step aside for the good of the country. Would American democracy have survived? Would Roosevelt, facing an armed force that outnumbered the entire United States Army, have chosen to fight a civil war rather than accept a figurehead role? Would congressional leaders have resisted or accommodated the new order? The European precedents were not encouraging. Democratic governments in Italy and Germany had capitulated to fascist movements with far less financial backing and popular support than the American conspirators commanded. Once fascist regimes were established, they proved remarkably difficult to dislodge. An American fascist government would have looked different from its European counterparts, but it would have been no less authoritarian. Instead of racial ideology, it would have been based on corporate efficiency and anti-communist paranoia. Instead of jackbooted stormtroopers, it would have featured well-dressed executives and patriotic veterans. The result would have been the same: the elimination of democratic accountability and the subordination of government to private power. Labor unions would have been banned as communist organizations. Social welfare programs would have been eliminated as socialist corruption. Independent journalism would have been replaced by corporate propaganda. Most chillingly, an American fascist regime would have been perfectly positioned to dominate the world. The United States in the 1930s was already the world's largest economy and most advanced industrial power. Under fascist leadership, that power would have been organized for conquest rather than democracy. World War II would have been very different, with America fighting alongside Germany and Italy rather than against them. The Holocaust might have been extended to the Americas. Democratic governments in Britain and France would have faced enemies on both sides of the Atlantic. The failure of the business plot changed the course of world history. Smedley Butler's refusal to become America's Mussolini preserved not just American democracy, but the possibility of global democracy. His integrity quite literally saved the world. But the story doesn't end with Butler's heroic refusal. The mentality that drove the business plot, the belief that wealthy elites know better than voters what's good for the country, didn't disappear when the conspiracy was exposed. Throughout the remainder of the 20th century, corporate interests continued to explore ways to subordinate democratic government to business priorities. Sometimes they worked within the system funding think tanks and lobbying organizations. Sometimes they worked outside it, supporting coups and dictatorships in countries where democratic governments threatened American business interests. The same families and corporations involved in the business plot went on to fund anti-communist movements during the Cold War, many of which had distinctly fascist characteristics. They supported military dictatorships in Latin America that eliminated labor unions and democratic institutions in the name of protecting free enterprise. They financed the careers of politicians who promised to reduce government regulation and eliminate social welfare programs. They created a network of conservative organizations dedicated to rolling back the New Deal reforms that had originally motivated their coup attempt. In many ways, they achieved through legal means what they had failed to accomplish through their conspiracy. By the end of the century, government regulation of business had been dramatically reduced, labor unions had been weakened, and social welfare programs had been cut. The gap between rich and poor had returned to levels not seen since the 1920s. The business plot was not an isolated incident, but the opening shot in a century-long campaign to restore the dominance of wealth over democracy. Understanding this history is crucial to understanding contemporary American politics and the ongoing tension between democratic values and corporate power. Most importantly, the story of the business plot demonstrates that American democracy is not invulnerable. It has survived not because of abstract principles or constitutional protections, but because individuals like Smedley Butler have chosen integrity over personal advantage at crucial moments. The lesson is clear: democracy is only as strong as the people who defend it. And sometimes those people are the ones you'd least expect. So the next time someone tells you that conspiracies like this don't happen in America, remind them about the business plot. Remind them that some of the most powerful men in the country once sat in smoke-filled rooms and planned to overthrow the government. And remind them that the only thing that stopped them was one man's refusal to betray his oath to the Constitution. That's the real lesson of the business plot heroes. Aren't born. They're made in moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things. Smedley Butler could have been rich, powerful, and respected by America's elite. Instead, he chose to be a patriot, and that choice changed everything. From a secret that threatened the government, we moved to a secret that poisoned the people, literally. Let's talk about the girls who shined. Picture America in the early 1900s, a time when science was promising to solve every problem humanity had ever faced. Electric lights were chasing away the darkness, automobiles were revolutionizing transportation, and medicine was discovering miracle cures for ancient diseases. It was an age of optimism when people believed that technology and chemistry could perfect human life. Into this world of scientific wonder came radium, a mysterious element that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898, radium captured the public imagination like nothing before it. Here was a substance that literally glowed in the dark, that seemed to possess some kind of magical energy. But radium wasn't just fascinating to scientists. It became the miracle cure that hucksters and legitimate businesses alike claimed could solve every health problem known to humanity. Radium water was marketed as a fountain of youth, promising to restore vigor and vitality to anyone who drank it. Radium toothpaste would give you perfect teeth. Radium face cream would make you beautiful. Radium chocolate would energize your body and mind. There were radium pendants for arthritis, radium suppositories for sexual dysfunction, and radium-laced spa treatments for everything from cancer to depression. One popular product called Radithor was essentially radium dissolved in water, marketed as a health tonic that wealthy Americans consumed by the bottle. The advertising was breathless and shameless. Radium, the wonder element. Proclaimed newspaper ads. Harness the power of the atom for perfect health. The marketing made radium sound like liquid sunshine, a concentrated dose of cosmic energy that could transform any ordinary person into a vibrant, healthy specimen of humanity. And for a while it seemed to work. People who consumed radium products reported feeling more energetic, more alert, more alive. What they didn't know was that radium is a radioactive element that attacks the body at the cellular level, and the initial boost of energy was actually their immune system going into overdrive, trying to fight off cellular damage. But radium wasn't just a health fad, it was big business. And the biggest business was painting watch dials with radium paint so they could glow in the dark. This wasn't just a novelty, it was a matter of life and death for soldiers in World War I who needed to read their watches in the trenches at night. Suddenly, radium dial painting became a crucial wartime industry. And who better to handle this delicate work than young women with steady hands and keen eyesight? The job paid well better than most work available to women at the time. The working conditions seemed pleasant, clean, well-lit factories filled with cheerful young women. And there was something almost magical about the work itself, painting with a substance that glowed with its own mysterious light. What these young women didn't know was that they were painting themselves to death, one brush stroke at a time. Step into the dial painting studio of the United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey, circa 1917. The first thing that strikes you is how normal it looks. Rows of young women, most of them teenagers, sitting at tables covered with watch dials, tiny brushes, and pots of glowing paint. They chat and laugh as they work the atmosphere more like a social club than a factory. The work itself seems almost artistic. Each woman carefully paints tiny numbers and hands-on watch faces, creating perfect glowing timepieces. The paint is a mixture of radium powder, zinc sulfide, and a binding agent that makes it adhere to metal. When fresh, it glows with a beautiful green-blue light that seems to pulse with life. The women earn about 3 times what they could make in other factories, and the work is clean and precise rather than dirty and dangerous like textile mills or chemical plants. Many of them are supporting their families, and the good wages make them feel independent and proud. But the real attraction is the radium itself. The supervisors tell them it's harmless, even beneficial. They're told that radium is so healthy that wealthy people pay enormous sums to drink radium water at expensive spas. Some of the women are encouraged to take leftover paint home to decorate their clothes, their hair, even their teeth for special occasions. The technique they're taught is called lip pointing or lip dip paint. To get the finest possible point on their brushes, they're instructed to shape the bristles with their lips. Dip the brush in radium paint, put it between your lips, point the brush, then paint the dial. Repeat this process dozens of times for each watch, hundreds of times each day. Every time they lip point, they're ingesting a small amount of radium. The supervisors assure them it's harmless, just a tiny amount of a beneficial substance. In fact, they're told that radium is so safe that it's used in medicines and health products. What they don't know is that the company's own scientists and executives have been studying radium's effects on laboratory animals for years. They know that radium causes cancer, bone deterioration, and death. They know that even tiny amounts can be lethal when ingested regularly. But they also know that this knowledge would be bad for business. The women working in the factories are completely unaware of this research. When they ask about safety, they're told that radium is not only harmless, but actually good for them. Some supervisors even claim that the radium paint will make the women healthier and more beautiful, that it will give them a youthful glow from the inside out. And in a twisted way, it does make them glow. After work, the women's clothes, hair, and skin shimmer with radioactive particles. They walk home through dark streets literally glowing like fairy tale characters. Some of them deliberately paint their nails and teeth with the leftover radium paint for parties delighting friends with their supernatural luminescence. The sight of these glowing girls became a local attraction. Children would follow them home from work just to see them shine in the dark. Young men were fascinated by dates who literally lit up the night. The women felt special, magical, chosen by science to be something more than ordinary. But the magic was killing them. Amelia Molly Magia was one of the most skilled dial painters at the U.S. Radium Corporation. She had been working there since 1917, 5 years of steady employment that had made her one of the factory's most experienced workers. At 24, she was confident, well paid, and proud of her skills. Then her teeth started falling out. It began with a toothache, the kind of dull throb that everyone experiences from time to time. But instead of going away, it got worse, much worse. When Molly went to the dentist in 1922, he found something he had never seen before. Her jawbone was literally disintegrating. The dentist tried to extract the infected tooth, but when he grabbed it with his forceps, the entire section of jawbone came away in his hand. Not just the tooth, but chunks of bone and tissue that crumbled like wet sand. Molly's jaw had become so brittle that it couldn't support the weight of her own teeth. What followed was a medical nightmare that would make a horror movie seem tame. Over the next few months, Molly's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her remaining teeth fell out one by one. Her jawbone continued to disintegrate, leaving gaping holes in her face. The pain was so intense that she could barely eat or speak. Doctor after doctor examined her, and none of them could understand what was happening. They had never seen anything like it. Some suspected cancer, others thought it might be a rare infection, but whatever was destroying Molly's body was unlike any disease in the medical literature. Meanwhile, other dial painters were developing similar symptoms. Grace Fryer noticed that her teeth were becoming loose. Catherine Schaub developed painful sores in her mouth. Edna Hussman's jaw began to swell and ache. One by one, the women who had spent years lip-pointing their brushes were developing the same mysterious, agonizing condition. The company's response was swift and ruthless. They claimed that the women's illnesses had nothing to do with radium. Company doctors suggested that the women were suffering from syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease that was deeply stigmatizing in the 1920s. The implication was clear. These women were not innocent victims of industrial poisoning, but promiscuous girls who had brought their suffering on themselves. This wasn't just medical malpractice. It was character assassination designed to discredit the victims before they could build a legal case. By suggesting that the women had syphilis, the company was destroying their reputations and making it less likely that juries would sympathize with them. But the truth was becoming impossible to hide. Molly Magia died on September 12, 1922, her death certificate listing ulcerative stomatitis as the cause. This was a euphemism. What had actually killed her was radiation poisoning that had turned her bones to powder and her blood to poison. The company buried her quickly and quietly, hoping her death would be forgotten. Instead, it was the beginning of a legal and scientific investigation that would expose one of the most callous corporate cover-ups in American history. The United States Radium Corporation had known for years that their product was deadly. As early as 1901, scientists had observed that radium caused skin burns and tissue damage. By 1914, research had clearly established that radium ingestion led to cancer and bone disease. Company executives had access to this research and understood its implications, but instead of warning their workers or changing their production methods, they chose to hide the truth. They hired scientists to produce research that downplayed radium's dangers. They bribed doctors to misdiagnose their workers' illnesses. They used their political connections to suppress government investigations. The company's strategy was sophisticated and multi-layered. First, they denied that radium had any harmful effects, claiming that the women's illnesses were coincidental or caused by other factors. When that became impossible to maintain, they shifted to arguing that the women had been exposed to radium outside the workplace, perhaps through cosmetics or health products. When independent scientists began studying the dial painters' illnesses, the company funded competing research designed to contradict their findings. They hired prominent physicians to testify that radium was harmless, even beneficial. They published fake scientific papers in medical journals and spread propaganda through friendly newspapers. Most cruelly, They turned the victims' symptoms against them. The bone deterioration caused by radium poisoning often affected the women's appearance, making them look gaunt and sickly. Company lawyers argued that these women were obviously in poor health for reasons unrelated to their work, perhaps due to moral failings or constitutional weakness. The syphilis angle was particularly vicious. In the 1920s, syphilis was associated with prostitution and moral degeneracy. By suggesting that their workers had contracted a sexually transmitted disease, the company was not just explaining their symptoms, but destroying their credibility as witnesses and their eligibility for sympathy. This strategy worked for years. The women's families were too poor to hire experienced lawyers. The medical establishment was slow to recognize a new form of industrial disease. The government agencies that might have investigated were either captured by industry influence or simply didn't exist yet. Meanwhile, the company continued to recruit new workers, continued to use the same dangerous production methods, and continued to lie about the safety of their procedures. Young women kept coming to work in the radium dial factories, drawn by good wages and reassurances about their safety. The executives who made these decisions weren't ignorant or misguided. They were making calculated choices to prioritize profits over human lives. They knew their workers were dying, and they chose to let them die rather than admit liability or change their practices. Grace Fryer was 19 when she started working at the U.S. Radium Corporation in 1917. By 1925, she was 27, and her body was falling apart. Her teeth had fallen out, her jaw was disintegrating, and she was in constant pain. But unlike many of her former co-workers, Grace was angry rather than resigned. She was determined to make the company pay for what they had done to her and her friends. Finding a lawyer willing to take on one of the most powerful corporations in America was nearly impossible. Most attorneys were afraid of the company's resources and political connections. Others worried about the scientific complexity of proving that radium exposure had caused the women's illnesses. Grace spent 2 years looking for legal representation before she found Raymond Berry, a young lawyer, willing to take on what seemed like an impossible case. Berry wasn't a prominent attorney or a specialist in industrial disease. He was just a man who believed that corporations shouldn't be allowed to poison their workers with impunity. The legal battle that followed was a preview of every corporate liability case that would come after it. The company hired teams of expensive lawyers and expert witnesses. They filed motion after motion to delay the trial, hoping the women would die before their case could be heard. They challenged every piece of evidence and questioned every scientific conclusion, but by 1927, the scientific evidence had become overwhelming. Independent researchers had definitively established that radium ingestion caused the specific pattern of bone disease that was killing the dial painters. The women's bodies were literally radioactive. Geiger counters placed near them would click frantically, detecting the radium that had accumulated in their bones and organs. The case drew national attention as newspapers began covering the story of young women who had been poisoned by their employer's negligence. The image of dying girls who still glowed in the dark captured the public imagination and generated sympathy for the victims. The company's legal strategy began to backfire. Their attempts to blame the women for their own illnesses seemed increasingly callous as evidence mounted that executives had known about radium's dangers for years. Their delay tactics became particularly cruel when it became clear that many of the plaintiffs were literally dying while waiting for their day in court. On June 4, 1928, 5 women, Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Larice, finally had their case heard in court. They were so weak that they could barely raise their hands to take the oath. Some had to be carried into the courtroom on stretchers. But their testimony was devastating. These women, who had once been healthy and vibrant, described in detail how their employers had assured them that radium was safe while knowing it was deadly. They told stories of supervisors encouraging them to use radium paint for cosmetic purposes, of company doctors misdiagnosing their illnesses, of executives who had lied to them for years. The trial lasted only a few days before the company agreed to an out-of-court settlement. Each woman received $10,000, about $150,000 in today's money, plus medical expenses and a $600 annual pension. It wasn't a fortune, but it was an acknowledgement of the company's guilt and a precedent for future cases. More importantly, the case established legal principles that would protect workers for generations. It established that employers had a duty to provide safe working conditions and to warn workers about known hazards. It created precedents for corporate liability that would be used in countless future cases involving asbestos, tobacco, chemicals, and other industrial toxins. Many of the radium dial painters died before they could collect their settlements. Others lived for years with the radioactive elements eating away at their bodies from the inside. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. Their fight for justice led to fundamental changes in how America regulates workplace safety and corporate responsibility. The Radium Girls case was one of the primary motivations for creating the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, in 1970. The principle that workers have a right to know about workplace hazards, now enshrined in federal law, was born from their struggle against corporate secrecy and deception. Their story also helped establish the field of industrial hygiene and occupational medicine. Before the radium cases, there was little systematic study of how workplace exposures affected worker health. The dial painters' illnesses forced scientists and doctors to develop new methods for studying occupational disease and protecting worker health. The legal precedents established by their cases became the foundation for modern product liability law. The principle that corporations can be held responsible for harm caused by their products, even when that harm becomes apparent years later, traces back to the Radium Girls' fight for justice. But perhaps most importantly, their story serves as a perpetual reminder of what happens when profit is prioritized over human welfare. The executives who poisoned these women weren't monsters. They were businessmen making what they saw as rational economic decisions. The danger lies not in exceptional evil, but in ordinary callousness enabled by unchecked corporate power. The physical legacy of the Radium Girls is equally haunting. When scientists exhumed some of their bodies decades later for research purposes, the bones still glowed with radioactive light. The radium that killed them had a half-life of about 600 years, meaning it will continue to emit radiation long after our civilization has crumbled to dust. There's something profoundly moving about that image. Young women who trusted their employers, who believed in the promise of science and progress, who wanted nothing more than to earn an honest living, still glowing in their graves, more than a century later. They are literally luminous martyrs to the cause of worker safety and corporate accountability. Their story also illuminates the particular vulnerability of women workers in the early 20th century. These young women were chosen for radium dial painting precisely because they were seen as docile, careful, and unlikely to cause trouble. The company assumed they could be exploited with impunity because they had little political or economic power. The decision to blame their illnesses on syphilis was a calculated attack on their character that would have been unthinkable if the victims had been men. The implication that their suffering was the result of sexual misconduct, rather than workplace exposure, was designed to destroy their credibility and discourage other victims from coming forward. But the Radium Girls refused to be silenced or discredited. Despite their physical weakness and social disadvantages, they fought back against one of the most powerful corporations in America. Their courage in the face of overwhelming odds established principles that continue to protect workers today. The story of the Radium Girls isn't just historical, it's a template for understanding how corporate irresponsibility continues to threaten public health. The same patterns of deception, delay, and victim blaming that characterize the radium cases have been repeated with asbestos, tobacco lead, paint chemical pesticides, and countless other products. In each case, corporations have known about the dangers of their products years or decades before that knowledge became public. In each case, they have chosen to hide that knowledge, discredit scientists who exposed it, and attack the victims who suffered from their negligence. The Radium Girls story teaches us to be skeptical of corporate assurances about product safety, especially when those products generate enormous profits. It reminds us that the free market doesn't automatically protect consumers or workers from dangerous products. That protection requires vigilant regulation and the courage of individuals willing to fight powerful interests. Their legacy is particularly relevant today as we grapple with new industrial hazards like nanoparticles, genetically modified organisms, and chemical additives whose long-term effects are unknown. The temptation to assume these products are safe because they're profitable remains as strong as ever. The Radium Girls also remind us that progress isn't always progressive. The radium craze of the early 1900s was driven by the same techno-optimism that characterizes much of our contemporary culture. People believed that science had unlocked a miracle substance that would solve health problems and improve human life. That optimism wasn't entirely wrong. Scientific progress has indeed improved human welfare in countless ways. But the Radium Girls' story shows what happens when commercial interests capture scientific innovation and use it to exploit rather than benefit humanity. Their glowing legacy illuminates a fundamental truth about American capitalism. The market rewards innovation and efficiency, but it doesn't automatically reward safety or social responsibility. Those values must be imposed from outside the market through regulation, litigation, and the organized resistance of people willing to fight for their rights. The young women who painted watch dials with radium thought they were participating in scientific progress. Instead, they became unwitting test subjects in a massive human experiment conducted without their knowledge or consent. Their suffering and death led to laws and institutions that have saved countless lives, but only because they had the courage to fight back against the forces that were killing them. In the end, the Radium Girls' story is both a tragedy and a triumph. It's a tragedy because young women died horrible deaths from corporate negligence and greed. But it's a triumph because their sacrifice led to changes that have protected millions of other workers from similar fates. They remind us that progress requires vigilance, that the powerful will always be tempted to exploit the powerless, and that ordinary people sometimes have to do extraordinary things to bend the arc of history toward justice. The Radium Girls still glow in their graves, eternal witnesses to the price of unchecked corporate power and the power of ordinary people to change the world. The Radium Girls were victims of corporate greed hiding behind the guise of progress. But what happens when the entity betraying you isn't a company but your own government hiding behind the guise of science that brings us to Tuskegee? Picture rural Alabama in 1932. The Great Depression has hit the South particularly hard, and for Black Americans in Macon County, life is a daily struggle against poverty, disease, and the suffocating weight of Jim Crow segregation. This is a world where separate is never equal, where Black children attend crumbling schools, while white children learn in modern buildings, where Black families are denied access to hospitals, doctors, and basic medical care. Into this world of systematic neglect comes an opportunity that seems too good to be true. The United States Public Health Service, the federal government's premier medical agency, is offering free health care to Black men in rural Alabama. Not just basic care, but comprehensive medical examinations, free meals, transportation to appointments, and even burial insurance. For poor sharecroppers and laborers who had never seen a doctor in their lives, this represented a medical miracle. The government doctors spoke of treating bad blood or catering, a catch-all term that local people used to describe various ailments, including fatigue, anemia, and what we would now recognize as sexually transmitted infections. Finally, it seems someone in authority cared about the health of Black folks in rural Alabama. 600 men signed up for the program, 399 who had syphilis and 201 who didn't, serving as a control group. They were told they would receive free treatment for bad blood, free meals on examination days, free transportation to and from appointments, and free burial insurance worth $50. A significant sum for families living in poverty. What these men didn't know was that they weren't patients. They were test subjects. The government doctors had no intention of treating their syphilis. Instead, they planned to study how the disease progressed when left completely untreated, documenting its effects on the human body, until death provided the final data point through autopsy. The study was officially called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male, and it would become one of the most shameful episodes in American medical history. For 40 years, the United States government would lie to black men about their medical care, deliberately withhold treatment for a deadly disease, and watch them suffer and die in the name of science. But to understand how this atrocity was possible, you need to understand the racial attitudes that made it seem not just acceptable but scientifically valuable to the doctors who conceived it. The Tuskegee study wasn't born in a vacuum. It emerged from a medical establishment that was deeply infected with racist pseudoscience. In 1932, many white doctors and scientists believed that black people were fundamentally different from white people, not just culturally, but biologically. They theorized that diseases affected black bodies differently, that black people had different pain tolerances, different intellectual capacities, different moral sensibilities. These weren't fringe beliefs held by a few extremists. They were mainstream scientific opinions taught in medical schools and published in respected journals. The American medical establishment had convinced itself that studying disease in black bodies was fundamentally different from studying disease in white bodies, and that knowledge gained from black subjects might not be applicable to white patients. This racist framework made the Tuskegee study seem scientifically legitimate to its organizers. Dr. Taliaferro Clark, who designed the study, genuinely believed he was conducting valuable research that would advance medical knowledge about how syphilis affected the Negro Constitution. The fact that this research required allowing men to suffer and die from a treatable disease was seen as an acceptable cost for scientific progress. The study was also influenced by earlier research conducted on white men in Norway, where doctors had studied untreated syphilis in patients who had limited access to medical care. But there was a crucial difference. The Norwegian study was observational, documenting cases where treatment was unavailable, while the Tuskegee study was experimental, deliberately withholding treatment that was readily available. The American doctors convinced themselves that this distinction didn't matter because they believed black men in rural Alabama wouldn't seek treatment anyway, due to poverty, ignorance, and cultural factors. They weren't preventing these men from receiving care, they told themselves. They were simply studying the natural progression of disease in a population that was unlikely to be treated regardless. This rationalization ignored the fundamental fact that the study participants had sought out medical care by joining the program. These weren't men who had rejected treatment. They were men who had been promised treatment and then deliberately deceived about receiving it. The study's organizers also believed they were providing some benefit to their subjects through regular medical examinations, nutritious meals, and social interaction. They convinced themselves that these modest benefits justified withholding life-saving treatment for a disease that would eventually kill or severely disable most of the untreated men. But perhaps most disturbingly, the doctors running the study seemed to view their subjects not as individual human beings with rights and agency, but as representatives of a racial group whose biological characteristics could be studied for the benefit of science. The men's names, personalities, families, and individual circumstances were largely irrelevant. What mattered was their value as research subjects. This dehumanizing perspective made it possible for caring, intelligent doctors to participate in what was essentially a slow-motion murder disguised as medical research. They weren't evil men in the traditional sense. They were products of a system that had taught them to see black lives as less valuable than white lives, and black suffering as less significant than scientific knowledge. Running a study that deliberately withholds medical treatment from sick men requires an elaborate system of lies, and the Tuskegee researchers became masters of deception. Every aspect of the study was designed to keep the subjects unaware of their true condition and the nature of the research being conducted on them. The men were never told they had syphilis. Instead, they were told they suffered from bad blood, and that the government doctors were providing them with treatment for this condition. When they received medical examinations, they were told these were therapeutic procedures rather than research activities. The treatments they received were elaborate placebos designed to maintain the illusion of care while providing no actual medical benefit. Men were given aspirin and iron supplements, told these were powerful medicines for bad blood. They received painful spinal taps, told these were special treatments when they were actually diagnostic procedures designed to study the progression of neurological syphilis. The researchers went to extraordinary lengths to maintain their deception. They coordinated with local doctors to ensure that any study participant who sought outside medical care wouldn't accidentally receive treatment for syphilis. They created fake treatment certificates to give men the impression they were receiving cutting-edge medical care. They even provided transportation to medical appointments to ensure the men would continue participating in regular examinations. When World War II created a draft that threatened to reveal the study participants' syphilis through mandatory military medical examinations, the researchers intervened to keep the men out of the military. They claimed this was to protect the men's health, but it was actually to protect the study's integrity. The researchers also cultivated relationships with local black leaders and institutions to legitimize their work in the community. They partnered with the Tuskegee Institute, a prominent black educational institution, lending credibility to their activities. They hired black nurses and support staff who could communicate more effectively with study participants and help maintain their trust. This strategy was particularly cynical because it exploited the social dynamics of racial segregation. In a world where black people had good reason to be suspicious of white authority figures, the involvement of respected black institutions and employees made the study seem more trustworthy. The head nurse for the study, Eunice Rivers, was a black woman who worked with the program for nearly its entire duration. Rivers genuinely cared about the men in the study and believed she was helping them receive medical care they wouldn't otherwise have access to. She became a trusted figure in the community, and her presence helped maintain the men's participation over decades. But Rivers was herself a victim of the study's deception. She was never told the true nature of the research, and apparently believed she was helping to provide medical care to underserved men. Her dedication to the participants was real, but it was being manipulated to serve a research agenda that she didn't understand. The study's deceptive practices extended to the medical literature as well. When researchers published papers about their findings, they described the study as research on untreated syphilis, without acknowledging that treatment was being deliberately withheld. They presented their work as observational research rather than experimental human subjects research, obscuring the ethical violations at the heart of their activities. The moral enormity of the Tuskegee study became clear in the 1940s when penicillin was discovered to be a highly effective cure for syphilis. For the first time in human history, doctors had a simple, safe, inexpensive treatment that could completely cure a disease that had plagued humanity for centuries. Any ethical medical researcher would have immediately provided penicillin to the Tuskegee study participants and ended the research. The scientific questions about untreated syphilis had become moot now that effective treatment was available. Continuing to study untreated disease when treatment existed would be a clear violation of medical ethics. Instead, the Tuskegee researchers made a conscious decision to withhold penicillin from their subjects. They didn't just fail to provide treatment, they actively prevented the men from receiving it. They coordinated with local doctors and public health officials to ensure that study participants wouldn't accidentally receive penicillin through other sources. This decision transformed the study from questionable research into clear-cut human experimentation. The researchers were no longer simply observing the natural history of disease. They were deliberately allowing men to suffer and die from a condition that could be easily cured. The justification for this decision reveals the twisted logic that guided the study. Researchers argued that providing treatment would compromise the scientific integrity of their research. They had invested decades in studying untreated syphilis, and introducing treatment now would make their data incomplete and less valuable. They also argued that the study participants were poor, uneducated men who were unlikely to complete a full course of penicillin treatment, even if it were offered. Better to continue the study as designed than to risk having men partially treated, which might compromise both their health and the research data. These arguments might sound reasonable until you consider what they actually mean: that scientific data was more valuable than human lives, that the integrity of research was more important than the well-being of research subjects, and that poor black men couldn't be trusted to take medicine properly and therefore didn't deserve the opportunity to try. The decision to withhold penicillin also reveals how the researchers viewed their subjects. These weren't patients who deserved medical care. They were specimens being studied for the benefit of science. Their individual welfare was irrelevant compared to the knowledge that could be gained from studying their disease. Over the following decades, many of the men in the study died from complications of untreated syphilis that could have been prevented with a few doses of penicillin. Others suffered blindness, insanity, heart disease, and neurological damage. Some infected their wives, who in turn passed the disease to their children. The human cost of the decision to withhold penicillin was enormous, but it was hidden from public view by the study's ongoing deception. The men and their families never knew that a cure existed and was being deliberately denied to them. They continued to trust the government doctors who were watching them die. By the 1960s, Peter Buxton was a young epidemiologist working for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention when he first learned about the Tuskegee study. Reading through old files, he discovered documentation of research that seemed to violate every principle of medical ethics he had been taught. Buxton was shocked to learn that the federal government was conducting research that deliberately withheld treatment from sick men. He was even more disturbed to discover that the study was ongoing, that men were still being denied treatment for a disease that had been curable for more than 20 years. His first instinct was to work within the system. He raised his concerns with his supervisors, arguing that the study was unethical and should be terminated immediately. He wrote memos documenting the ethical violations and requesting that the study be ended. The response he received was bureaucratic stonewalling. His supervisors acknowledged his concerns but argued that ending the study prematurely would waste the valuable scientific data that had been collected over decades. They suggested that the study participants were receiving some benefit from irregular medical examinations and social support, even if they weren't receiving treatment for syphilis. Most disturbingly, Buxton was told that the study couldn't be ended because it would be too embarrassing to the federal government. Admitting that the study was unethical would require acknowledging that the government had been lying to and experimenting on American citizens for decades. The political cost of this admission was deemed too high. Buxton continued to raise his concerns internally for several years, but it became clear that the Public Health Service had no intention of ending the study voluntarily. The research had become institutionally invested. Too many careers and too much prestige were tied to its continuation. Frustrated by the lack of response to his internal complaints, Buxton began to consider external action. He was risking his career by going public with his concerns, but he had reached the conclusion that the study's continuation was a moral emergency that required dramatic action. In 1972, Buxton contacted Jean Heller, a reporter for the Associated Press, and provided her with detailed documentation of the Tuskegee study. He explained the history of the research, the decision to withhold penicillin, and the ongoing deception of study participants. Heller was initially skeptical. The story seemed too outrageous to be true. Could the federal government really have been conducting deadly experiments on American citizens for 40 years? But as she investigated Buxton's claims, she found that every detail was documented in government records. On July 25, 1972, the Associated Press published Jean Heller's story about the Tuskegee study under the headline, "Syphilis Victims in U.S. Study Went Untreated for 40 Years." The article revealed for the first time that the federal government had been conducting unethical medical research on black men in Alabama since 1932. The story created an immediate sensation. The American public was shocked to learn that their government had been deliberately withholding medical treatment from sick men in the name of science. The revelation came at a time when Americans were already questioning government honesty due to the Vietnam War and Watergate scandal, and the Tuskegee study seemed to confirm their worst suspicions about official deception. Civil rights leaders were particularly outraged. The study seemed to confirm that the federal government viewed black lives as expendable and was willing to use black bodies for medical experimentation. The parallels to Nazi medical experiments were obvious and deeply disturbing. Medical ethicists were equally horrified. The study violated every principle of informed consent and patient welfare that had been established after World War II. The revelation that American doctors had been conducting unethical research while criticizing Nazi medicine was profoundly embarrassing to the medical establishment. The government's initial response was defensive and tone-deaf. Officials argued that the study had been conducted according to the ethical standards of its time and that it had produced valuable scientific knowledge. They suggested that criticism of the study was unfair because it applied contemporary ethical standards to historical research. But this defense was quickly abandoned as the full scope of the study's deception became clear. It became obvious that the research had violated ethical principles that existed when it began, not just standards that had evolved later. The decision to withhold penicillin in the 1940s couldn't be justified by any contemporary ethical framework. Within a day of the story's publication, the Department of Health Education and Welfare announced that the Tuskegee study would be terminated immediately. After 40 years of lies and deception, the government finally acknowledged that the research was unethical and should not continue. But ending the study didn't address the harm that had already been done to its participants. Many of the men had died from complications of untreated syphilis that could have been prevented. Others were suffering from advanced disease that might have been avoided with earlier treatment. Wives and children had been infected with a disease that could have been cured. The government also faced the difficult task of explaining 40 years of deception to the surviving study participants. How do you tell men who have trusted you for decades that you have been lying to them about their medical care? How do you acknowledge that you allowed them to suffer and die from a disease you could have cured? The revelation of the Tuskegee study led to fundamental changes in how medical research is conducted in the United States. The public outrage over the government's deception of study participants created political pressure for new regulations protecting human subjects in research. In 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act, which established institutional review boards to oversee human subjects research, and created the requirement for informed consent in all federally funded studies. The law was directly inspired by the Tuskegee study and was designed to prevent similar abuses in the future. The study's survivors and their families filed a class action lawsuit against the federal government seeking compensation for the harm they had suffered. In 1973, the case was settled for $10 million, with individual payments ranging from a few thousand to $37,500 depending on the extent of harm suffered. But the lawsuit's most important provision wasn't financial. It was the requirement that the government provide free medical care for all study participants and their families. This was an acknowledgement that the harm caused by the study extended beyond the original subjects to their wives and children who had been infected with syphilis. The government also agreed to provide burial services for study participants, fulfilling a promise that had been made when they first enrolled in 1932. It was a small gesture, but it represented an attempt to honor commitments that had been made under false pretenses decades earlier. In 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology to the Tuskegee study survivors on behalf of the American people. Speaking at a White House ceremony attended by 5 surviving participants, Clinton acknowledged that what the government had done was deeply wrong and pledged that such research would never be conducted again. Clinton's apology was important, not just for what it said, but for what it represented: an acknowledgement that the federal government had violated the trust of American citizens and bore responsibility for the harm that resulted. It was a rare moment of official accountability for historical injustices. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Tuskegee study is its impact on the relationship between Black Americans and the medical establishment. The revelation that government doctors had lied to and experimented on Black men for 40 years created a deep and lasting mistrust that continues to affect public health efforts today. The Tuskegee study didn't just harm its direct participants, It poisoned the relationship between Black Americans and medical institutions for generations. When word of the study spread through Black communities, it confirmed suspicions that many people had harbored about the medical establishment's attitudes toward Black patients. The study became a powerful symbol of medical racism and government deception. Parents began warning their children to be suspicious of medical research and government health programs. Community leaders advised caution when dealing with public health officials. The very institutions that were supposed to protect public health had become objects of suspicion and fear. This mistrust has had devastating consequences for Black Americans' health. Studies have shown that knowledge of the Tuskegee study is associated with reduced willingness to participate in medical research, seek preventive care, and trust medical professionals. Black Americans are less likely to donate organs, participate in clinical trials, or follow medical recommendations, in part because of lingering suspicions rooted in the Tuskegee legacy. The impact was particularly severe during the early years of the AIDS epidemic, when public health officials tried to implement prevention programs in Black communities. They encountered resistance from people who feared they were being subjected to another Tuskegee-style experiment. Some community members suspected that AIDS itself was a government conspiracy designed to eliminate Black people. These suspicions weren't entirely irrational given the history of medical experimentation on Black Americans. In addition to Tuskegee, there had been other documented cases of unethical research conducted on Black subjects, including radiation experiments, sterilization programs, and pharmaceutical testing. The COVID-19 pandemic provided another stark example of how the Tuskegee legacy continues to affect public health. Black Americans showed higher rates of vaccine hesitancy, with many explicitly citing the Tuskegee study as a reason for their mistrust of government health recommendations. This mistrust represents one of the study's most tragic legacies. The men who were deceived and harmed by the Tuskegee researchers have been joined by countless others whose health has suffered because they couldn't trust the medical system that failed their predecessors. The irony is profound. A study that was supposedly conducted to advance medical knowledge has actually impeded medical progress by making an entire community suspicious of medical research and treatment. The knowledge gained from watching men die of untreated syphilis has been far outweighed by the harm caused by the loss of trust in medical institutions. The Tuskegee study wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of how powerful institutions have exploited vulnerable populations in the name of science and progress. Understanding this pattern is crucial to preventing similar abuses in the future. The study was made possible by the intersection of several forms of powerlessness. The participants were poor, which made them dependent on free government services. They were Black, which made them vulnerable to racial discrimination and medical racism. They were rural and poorly educated, which made them less likely to question medical authority or understand their rights. The researchers exploited each of these vulnerabilities systematically. They used the men's poverty to make participation attractive through free meals and medical examinations. They used racial stereotypes to justify withholding treatment, arguing that Black men wouldn't complete therapy anyway. They used the men's limited education to maintain deceptions that would have been impossible with more sophisticated subjects. The study also demonstrates how institutional authority can be used to legitimize unethical behavior. The involvement of the federal government, prestigious medical institutions, and respected Black organizations like the Tuskegee Institute gave the research a veneer of legitimacy that made it difficult for participants to question. The researchers weren't evil individuals, but products of a system that devalued Black lives and prioritized scientific knowledge over human welfare. They were able to rationalize their behavior because they operated within institutions that shared their assumptions about racial differences and the acceptable costs of medical progress. This institutional dimension of the Tuskegee study is particularly important because it shows how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary harm when they operate within systems that normalize unethical behavior. The nurses, administrators, and local officials who helped maintain the study weren't necessarily malicious. They were following institutional protocols that seemed legitimate at the time. The study's longevity also reveals how institutional momentum can perpetuate harmful practices long after their original justifications have disappeared. By the 1960s, few medical professionals would have defended the ethical framework that had originally justified the study, but the research continued because it had become institutionally embedded. Ending the study would have required admitting decades of unethical behavior, which would have been embarrassing and potentially legally damaging to the institutions involved. It was easier to continue the research than to acknowledge its fundamental problems. The Tuskegee study offers crucial lessons about medical ethics, informed consent, and the protection of human subjects in research, but its relevance extends far beyond medical research to broader questions about how power operates in American society. The study demonstrates the importance of transparency in research and the danger of allowing any institution to operate in secret without external oversight. The 40-year duration of the study was made possible by the lack of independent monitoring and the absence of meaningful accountability mechanisms. It also shows the importance of genuine informed consent in research. The Tuskegee participants weren't just uninformed about the risks and benefits of their participation. They were actively deceived about the nature of the research being conducted on them. True informed consent requires not just disclosure of information, but honest communication and respect for participants' autonomy. The study illustrates how institutional racism can corrupt scientific research and turn it into a tool of oppression rather than liberation. The assumption that black lives were less valuable than white lives and that black suffering was acceptable if it produced knowledge that might benefit white people poisoned the entire research enterprise. Perhaps most importantly, the study demonstrates the crucial role of whistleblowers in exposing institutional wrongdoing. Peter Buxton's decision to go public with his concerns about the study required considerable personal courage and professional sacrifice. Without his willingness to risk his career for moral principles, the study might have continued indefinitely. The Tuskegee study also shows how historical injustices can have long-lasting consequences that extend far beyond their immediate victims. The mistrust generated by the study continues to affect public health efforts decades after the research ended, demonstrating that institutional wrongdoing can create societal wounds that take generations to heal. Understanding the Tuskegee study is essential for anyone who wants to understand the relationship between race power and medicine in America. It reveals how scientific authority can be used to legitimize exploitation and how the pursuit of knowledge can become corrupted when it isn't constrained by ethical principles. The study's legacy also reminds us that medical progress isn't automatically beneficial if it's achieved through unethical means. The knowledge gained from studying untreated syphilis was far outweighed by the harm caused to the study's participants and the broader damage to public trust in medical institutions. In the decades following the study's exposure, some of the survivors shared their experiences, providing first-hand accounts of what it was like to be deceived and experimented upon by their own government. Their testimonies offer powerful insights into the human cost of the research. Charlie Pollard, one of the study's survivors, described his experience this way. "They never told us we had bad blood. They just said we had bad blood. They never told us what we were really in for." His words capture the fundamental deception at the heart of the study, the way participants were kept ignorant of their true condition and the nature of the research being conducted on them. Herman Shaw, another survivor, spoke about the impact of learning the truth about the study. "I felt like a fool. I trusted them. I thought they were helping me." His testimony reveals the profound betrayal felt by men who had believed they were receiving medical care when they were actually being used as research subjects. The survivors' accounts also revealed the study's impact on their families. Wives and children who had been infected with syphilis because treatment was withheld from the study participants became secondary victims of the research. The disease spread through families and communities because of the government's decision to prioritize research over public health. Some survivors expressed anger at being deceived, but others focused on their hope that their suffering might prevent similar abuses in the future. Their testimonies became powerful tools for educating medical professionals and the public about the importance of ethical research practices. The survivors who lived long enough to see the study exposed also witnessed the changes in medical research that their suffering had helped bring about. The establishment of institutional review boards, informed consent requirements, and other protections for human subjects represented a direct response to the abuses they had endured. Their stories serve as permanent reminders of what can happen when medical research is conducted without proper ethical oversight. They ensure that the lessons of Tuskegee won't be forgotten and that future generations of researchers will understand the human cost of unethical experimentation. The Tuskegee study ended more than 50 years ago, but its legacy continues to shape American medicine and public health. The mistrust it generated persists in Black communities, affecting everything from vaccine acceptance to clinical trial participation to routine medical care. This ongoing impact demonstrates that institutional wrongdoing can create wounds that persist long after the original harm has ended. The government's apology and financial compensation for the study's survivors, while important, couldn't undo decades of deception or restore the trust that had been shattered. The study also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked institutional power and the importance of protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation. It shows how easily scientific authority can be corrupted when it operates without ethical constraints or meaningful oversight. But perhaps most importantly, the Tuskegee study reminds us that medical progress must be built on a foundation of trust, honesty, and respect for human dignity. Knowledge gained through deception and exploitation isn't just morally tainted, it's ultimately counterproductive because it undermines the trust that effective medical care requires. The men who were deceived and harmed by the Tuskegee study paid a terrible price for these lessons. Their suffering led to fundamental changes in how medical research is conducted and how human subjects are protected. Their legacy is a medical establishment that is more ethical, more transparent, and more accountable than the one that betrayed them. But their story also serves as a permanent warning about what can happen when power operates without accountability, when scientific authority is used to exploit rather than serve, and when some lives are deemed less valuable than others. The Tuskegee study must never be forgotten, because forgetting would dishonor its victims and invite repetition of their suffering. The bad blood that the study claimed to treat was never in the participants' bodies. It was in the system that used and betrayed them. Healing that wound requires more than medical advances. It requires a commitment to justice, transparency, and the fundamental principle that all human lives have equal value. That healing is still incomplete, and the work of earning back trust continues. The Tuskegee study reminds us that this work is never finished, that the price of medical progress must never again be paid with deception, exploitation, and human suffering. The Tuskegee study was a secret war on the bodies of a few hundred men, but our final secret was a secret war on the minds of millions of Americans, orchestrated by the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country. To understand COINTELPRO, you first need to understand John Edgar Hoover, the man who turned the Federal Bureau of Investigation into his personal intelligence empire, and held that power for nearly 5 decades. Hoover became director of the FBI in 1924 at the age of 29 and held the position until his death in 1972. For almost half a century, he was arguably the most powerful unelected official in American government, a man who collected secrets about presidents and senators and used that information to ensure his own survival and the expansion of his agency's power. But Hoover wasn't just a bureaucratic empire builder. He was a true believer in a particular vision of America that saw dissent as disloyalty and difference as danger. In his worldview, communist civil rights activists, anti-war protesters, and anyone who challenged the established order were all part of a vast conspiracy to destroy American civilization. Picture Hoover in his office in the 1960s, a short, stocky man in an immaculate suit surrounded by flags and photographs of himself, with various presidents poring over intelligence reports about American citizens who had committed no crimes other than expressing unpopular opinions or organizing for social change. This wasn't paranoia in the clinical sense, it was ideology. Hoover genuinely believed that internal subversion was a greater threat to America than external enemies. He saw domestic dissent not as a sign of democratic vitality, but as evidence of foreign manipulation and moral corruption. His vision of America was profoundly conservative and deeply racialized. He believed that the civil rights movement was controlled by communists, that anti-war protesters were tools of foreign enemies, and that any challenge to traditional authority structures was inherently suspect. But Hoover understood that simply investigating suspected subversives wasn't enough. If these movements were truly threatening American security, then they had to be actively disrupted, discredited, and destroyed. Traditional law enforcement methods were inadequate for this mission. What was needed was a covert war against domestic enemies. This thinking led to the creation of COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, in 1956. The program's stated purpose was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize domestic political organizations that Hoover deemed subversive. Notice the language: not investigate, not arrest, not prosecute, but neutralize. COINTELPRO wasn't about enforcing the law. It was about destroying political movements through any means necessary. COINTELPRO's scope was breathtaking in its breadth. Over its 15-year official existence, the program targeted virtually every significant progressive political movement in American society. The original target was the Communist Party USA, which seemed like a legitimate counterintelligence concern given the Cold War context. But the program quickly expanded to include civil rights organizations, anti-war groups, student movements, black nationalist organizations, Puerto Rican independence groups, and eventually even mainstream liberal organizations that Hoover considered too radical. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Martin Luther King Jr., was subjected to intensive COINTELPRO operations, despite being explicitly committed to nonviolence and working within the legal system. The NAACP, America's oldest civil rights organization, was targeted for surveillance and disruption. Even the relatively conservative Urban League came under FBI scrutiny. The Black Panther Party became perhaps COINTELPRO's most intensively targeted organization. Hoover declared the Panthers the greatest threat to internal security of the country and authorized a campaign of harassment, infiltration, and violence that eventually contributed to the organization's destruction. Student organizations weren't spared. Students for a Democratic Society, the primary organization of the 1960s student movement, was infiltrated and disrupted. Campus anti-war groups found their meetings monitored, their leaders harassed, and their activities sabotaged. The program even targeted individual Americans whose only crime was expressing unpopular political views. Writers, artists, intellectuals, and activists found themselves subjected to FBI harassment simply because they had criticized government policies or supported causes that Hoover opposed. The criteria for targeting were deliberately vague, allowing FBI agents enormous discretion in deciding who constituted a threat to national security. Internal FBI documents reveal that the real standard wasn't criminal activity, but political orientation. Anyone who challenged racial segregation, questioned American foreign policy, or advocated for social change could potentially become a COINTELPRO target. COINTELPRO operations employed tactics that would have made the KGB proud. The program's methods were sophisticated, ruthless, and completely outside the bounds of legal law enforcement. Surveillance was the foundation of all COINTELPRO operations. The FBI bugged offices, homes, and hotel rooms. They tapped phones, opened mail, and followed targets everywhere they went. They photographed people entering meetings, recorded private conversations, and compiled detailed dossiers on the personal lives of American citizens. But surveillance was just the beginning. The real goal was disruption. and the FBI developed an arsenal of dirty tricks designed to destroy political organizations from within. Infiltration was a primary tactic. The FBI recruited informants and planted agents provocateurs inside target organizations. These weren't just passive observers. They were active participants who worked to divide organizations, provoke conflicts, and discredit leaders. Some infiltrators were paid informants recruited from within the organizations themselves. Others were FBI agents who assumed false identities and worked their way into leadership positions. The most effective infiltrators often became trusted advisors to movement leaders, giving them access to sensitive information and strategic plans. The FBI also mastered the art of psychological warfare. They sent anonymous letters designed to create suspicion and paranoia within organizations. They forged documents to make it appear that leaders were FBI informants or embezzling funds. They created fake organizations to compete with legitimate groups for members and resources. One of COINTELPRO's most vicious tactics was using personal information gathered through surveillance to destroy individuals' reputations and relationships. The FBI would threaten to expose extramarital affairs, homosexuality, financial problems, or other personal secrets, unless targets abandoned their political activities. The campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. exemplified this approach. The FBI wiretapped King's hotel rooms, recorded his extramarital encounters, and then sent him anonymous packages containing recordings of his private moments, along with letters suggesting he should commit suicide. COINTELPRO also employed what we would now recognize as fake news and disinformation campaigns. The FBI created phony publications, planted false stories in mainstream media, and spread rumors designed to discredit target organizations and individuals. They were particularly skilled at exploiting existing tensions within the civil rights and anti-war movements. The FBI would exacerbate conflicts between different organizations, encourage factional disputes, and generally work to prevent effective coalition building. Legal harassment was another key tactic. The FBI would coordinate with local police to arrest activists, on minor charges file frivolous lawsuits, and generally make political organizing as difficult and expensive as possible. In some cases, COINTELPRO operations escalated to actual violence. The most notorious example was the 1969 assassination of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton in Chicago, where FBI informants provided intelligence that helped local police kill Hampton and another Panther member in what was presented as a shootout, but was actually a carefully planned execution. No COINTELPRO operation was more extensive or vicious than the FBI's campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. Hoover's hatred of King was personal and visceral, combining racial prejudice with ideological opposition to the civil rights movement. Hoover was convinced that King was either a communist or under communist influence, despite the complete lack of evidence for this belief. He ordered intensive surveillance of King starting in 1961, shortly after King emerged as a national civil rights leader. The surveillance revealed no evidence of communist connections, but it did provide the FBI with detailed knowledge of King's personal life, including his extramarital affairs. Hoover decided to use this information to destroy King's reputation and effectiveness as a leader. The FBI's campaign against King included almost every tactic in the COINTELPRO playbook. They bugged his home office and hotel rooms. They wiretapped his phones and intercepted his mail. They planted informants in his organization and tried to disrupt his fundraising efforts. Most notoriously, they sent King a package containing recordings of his extramarital encounters, along with an anonymous letter that many historians interpret as encouraging suicide. The letter read in part, "King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do it. This exact number has been selected for a specific reason. It has definite practical significance. You are done." The FBI also worked to prevent King from receiving recognition and support. They tried to block his selection for the Nobel Peace Prize and worked to discourage universities from awarding him honorary degrees. They spread rumors about his personal life and political associations to friendly journalists and politicians. When King began speaking out against the Vietnam War in 1967, the FBI's hostility intensified. Hoover saw King's anti-war activism as proof of his disloyalty and expanded the surveillance and harassment campaign. The FBI's war against King continued right up to his assassination in 1968. While there's no credible evidence that the FBI was directly involved in King's murder, their years of harassment and surveillance had certainly contributed to an atmosphere of hostility and violence around the civil rights leader. After King's death, the FBI continued its campaign against his legacy, working to prevent the establishment of Martin Luther King Day as a national holiday and spreading derogatory information about King to historians and biographers. COINTELPRO might have continued indefinitely, if not for the courage of 8 anti-war activists who decided to take extraordinary action to expose the FBI's domestic surveillance operations. On March 8, 1971, while much of America was distracted by the Muhammad Ali Joe Frazier heavyweight championship fight, a group calling itself the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI broke into a small FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. The burglars weren't professional criminals. They were professors, a social worker, a cab driver, and other ordinary citizens who had become convinced that the FBI was engaged in illegal surveillance of anti-war and civil rights activists. They decided that the only way to prove their suspicions was to steal FBI documents and make them public. The media office was chosen because it was small and lightly secured, but it turned out to contain a treasure trove of information about FBI domestic surveillance operations. The burglars took every document in the office, copying them, and then mailing selections to journalists and politicians. The stolen documents revealed for the first time the existence of COINTELPRO and provided detailed evidence of the FBI's domestic surveillance and disruption activities. The word COINTELPRO appeared in many of the documents, but its meaning wasn't immediately clear to the journalists who received them. Betty Metzger, a reporter for the Washington Post, was among the first journalists to receive the stolen documents. Her investigation revealed a systematic program of domestic surveillance and harassment that went far beyond anything the FBI had publicly acknowledged. The documents showed that the FBI was not just investigating suspected criminals, but was actively working to disrupt legal political activities by American citizens. They revealed the use of informants, the monitoring of civil rights and anti-war groups, and the FBI's efforts to create dissension within political organizations. Perhaps most shocking was the scope of the surveillance. The documents suggested that the FBI was monitoring virtually every significant political organization in the country and maintaining files on hundreds of thousands of American citizens. The release of the media documents created a sensation and sparked congressional investigations into FBI domestic surveillance activities. For the first time, the American public learned that their premier law enforcement agency had been functioning as a domestic intelligence service with almost no oversight or accountability. The exposure of the media documents put enormous pressure on FBI Director Hoover to end COINTELPRO. The program had operated in complete secrecy for 15 years, but now its existence was public knowledge and its methods were under scrutiny. In April 1971, just 1 month after the media break-in, Hoover officially terminated COINTELPRO. In a memo to FBI field offices, he wrote that the program was being ended because of the increased attention to FBI domestic surveillance activities. But Hoover's decision to end COINTELPRO didn't represent a change of heart about domestic surveillance. It was a tactical retreat designed to protect the FBI from further embarrassment. Many of the same activities continued under different names and bureaucratic structures. The termination of COINTELPRO also didn't address the damage that had already been done to American political organizations and individuals. 15 years of surveillance harassment and disruption had taken a devastating toll on the civil rights movement, anti-war organizations, and other progressive political groups. Some organizations never recovered from COINTELPRO operations. The Black Panther Party, which had been subjected to particularly intense FBI attention, was effectively destroyed by the combination of internal conflicts exacerbated by FBI infiltration and external pressure from law enforcement agencies. Individual activists were often left with ruined reputations, broken relationships, and psychological trauma from years of harassment and surveillance. Many people withdrew from political activity entirely, having learned that exercising their constitutional rights could result in government persecution. The broader impact on American democracy was equally significant. COINTELPRO had a chilling effect on political dissent as people became aware that expressing unpopular opinions or joining certain organizations could result in FBI surveillance and harassment. The program also revealed the dangers of allowing any government agency to operate without meaningful oversight or accountability. For 15 years, the FBI had conducted domestic intelligence operations that violated the constitutional rights of American citizens, and these activities had been completely hidden from Congress, the courts, and the public. The revelation of COINTELPRO led to the most comprehensive investigation of U.S. intelligence agencies in American history. In 1975, the Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities, commonly known as the Church Committee after its chairman Senator Frank Church, began a sweeping investigation of FBI, CIA, and NSA domestic surveillance activities. The Church Committee's investigation revealed the full scope of COINTELPRO for the first time. Committee staff reviewed thousands of FBI documents and interviewed hundreds of former agents, activists, and government officials. Their findings were devastating. The committee documented 370 separate COINTELPRO operations conducted between 1956 and 1971. These operations had targeted 2,600 individuals and organizations, including some of the most prominent civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and political dissidents in American history. The investigation revealed that COINTELPRO had employed tactics that were not just ethically questionable, but clearly illegal. The FBI had committed burglary, mail fraud, wiretapping without warrants, and other crimes in pursuit of its domestic surveillance mission. Perhaps most disturbing was the committee's finding that COINTELPRO operations had sometimes resulted in violence and death. The committee directly linked FBI operations to the deaths of several Black Panthers and other activists, showing that the Bureau's domestic surveillance program had sometimes become an assassination program. The Church Committee also revealed that COINTELPRO was just one part of a much larger domestic surveillance apparatus. The FBI maintained files on over 500,000 American citizens and 25,000 organizations, most of whom had never been suspected of any criminal activity. The committee's final report, published in 1976, concluded that the intelligence agencies had systematically violated the constitutional rights of American citizens and had operated with virtually no oversight or accountability. The report documented a pattern of abuse that extended far beyond COINTELPRO to include CIA domestic surveillance, NSA monitoring of international communications, and other illegal intelligence activities. The Church Committee's revelations led to significant reforms in how American intelligence agencies operate. Congress passed new laws requiring judicial oversight of domestic surveillance activities and establishing clear boundaries between foreign intelligence and domestic law enforcement. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 created a special court to approve wiretaps and other surveillance activities related to foreign intelligence, ensuring that even national security investigations would be subject to some form of judicial oversight. New FBI guidelines were established limiting the Bureau's domestic surveillance activities and requiring higher levels of approval for investigations of American citizens. The FBI was prohibited from investigating groups or individuals based solely on their political beliefs or associations. Congressional oversight of intelligence agencies was strengthened through the creation of permanent intelligence committees in both houses of Congress. These committees were given access to classified information and the authority to investigate intelligence activities. But the reforms had significant limitations. The new oversight mechanisms relied heavily on good faith compliance by intelligence agencies, and there were few meaningful penalties for violations. The Special Surveillance Court established by FISA operated in secret and rarely denied government requests for surveillance warrants. More fundamentally, the reforms didn't address the underlying problem that had made COINTELPRO possible: the belief within intelligence agencies that domestic dissent was inherently threatening to national security. While the methods might have changed, the mindset that saw political activism as potential subversion remained largely intact. The limitations of these reforms became apparent in subsequent decades as new surveillance technologies and national security concerns led to the expansion of domestic intelligence activities. The 9/11 attacks in particular provided justification for new surveillance programs that bore uncomfortable similarities to COINTELPRO. The end of COINTELPRO didn't end government surveillance of American citizens. It just drove it underground and eventually into the digital realm. The same mentality that created COINTELPRO adapted to new technologies and new justifications for monitoring domestic political activity. The USA Patriot Act, passed after 9/11, dramatically expanded government surveillance powers and reduced judicial oversight of intelligence activities. Many of the restrictions placed on the FBI after the Church Committee investigations were weakened or eliminated in the name of fighting terrorism. The National Security Agency's bulk data collection programs revealed by Edward Snowden in 2013 showed that the government was once again conducting mass surveillance of American citizens. While these programs were ostensibly focused on foreign intelligence, they collected vast amounts of information about domestic political activities and associations. Social media and digital communications created new opportunities for the kind of surveillance and disruption that characterized COINTELPRO. Government agencies could now monitor political organizations and activists through their online activities, track their associations through digital communications, and potentially disrupt their activities through cyber operations. The psychological operations that were central to COINTELPRO found new expression in the digital age through disinformation campaigns, fake social media accounts, and algorithmic manipulation of information flows. The same tactics used to divide and discredit political movements in the 1960s could now be deployed at massive scale through digital platforms. Most disturbing was the way that private technology companies became partners in government surveillance, providing access to user data and communications that would have required extensive illegal operations during the COINTELPRO era. The corporate surveillance apparatus that emerged in the digital age made government monitoring of citizens easier and more comprehensive than anything Hoover could have imagined. COINTELPRO ended more than 50 years ago, but the questions it raised about the balance between security and freedom remain as relevant as ever. How much surveillance of domestic political activity should a democratic government be allowed to conduct? What oversight mechanisms are sufficient to prevent abuse of surveillance powers? How can citizens protect themselves from government monitoring of their political activities? These questions have become more urgent in the digital age when government surveillance capabilities far exceed anything available during the COINTELPRO era. The same technologies that make communication and organization easier for citizens also make surveillance and disruption easier for governments. The COINTELPRO story isn't just history, it's a warning about what can happen when citizens stop paying attention to what their government does in their name. It reminds us that the Constitution is just a piece of paper unless people are willing to defend the principles it contains, even when that defense requires personal sacrifice and courage. The program's victims paid a terrible price for these lessons. Activists were harassed, imprisoned, and sometimes killed. Organizations were destroyed, movements were disrupted, and countless Americans were discouraged from exercising their constitutional rights. Their suffering wasn't in vain if it helps future generations understand the importance of limiting government power and protecting political freedom. But the COINTELPRO legacy also offers hope. It shows that even the most powerful government agencies can be held accountable when citizens have the courage to demand the truth. It demonstrates that democratic institutions, while fragile, can respond to revelations of abuse and implement meaningful reforms. The media burglars were never caught or prosecuted, despite one of the most intensive FBI investigations in the Bureau's history. They remained anonymous for more than 40 years, finally revealing their identities in 2014 when most were in their 70s and 80s. Their decision to come forward was motivated by concern about contemporary surveillance programs that they saw as repeating the mistakes of the COINTELPRO era. Their story reminds us that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they have the courage to act on their principles. The 8 citizens who broke into a small FBI office in Pennsylvania changed the course of American history by exposing a program that was systematically violating the constitutional rights of American citizens. The COINTELPRO legacy challenges every American to ask difficult questions about the balance between security and freedom, the proper role of government surveillance, and the responsibility of citizens to hold their government accountable. These aren't abstract, philosophical questions. They're practical issues that affect the ability of Americans to organize protest and participate in democratic politics. The program's history also reminds us that government officials will always claim that their surveillance activities are limited, legal, and necessary for national security. The same assurances given about COINTELPRO were later revealed to be completely false, and there's no reason to assume that contemporary assurances about surveillance programs are any more reliable. In the end, the COINTELPRO story is both a cautionary tale and a call to action. It warns us about what can happen when government power goes unchecked, but it also shows us that citizens have the power to expose abuse and demand accountability. The choice between surveillance and freedom, between security and democracy, isn't made by government officials. It's made by ordinary citizens who decide whether they're willing to defend their rights or surrender them for the promise of safety. That choice remains before us today, as relevant now as it was during the height of COINTELPRO operations. The technology has changed, the justifications have evolved, but the fundamental question remains the same. Will we allow our government to monitor and control our political activities in the name of security, or will we demand the transparency and accountability that democracy requires? The answer to that question will determine not just our security, but our freedom. The COINTELPRO legacy reminds us that the two aren't always compatible, and that sometimes we must choose which we value more. The activists who were targeted by COINTELPRO made their choice. They chose freedom over safety, principle over convenience, democracy over authoritarianism. Their courage in the face of government persecution provides a model for how citizens should respond to contemporary threats to democratic freedom. They remind us that defending democracy isn't someone else's responsibility. It's the duty of every citizen who values freedom and wants to preserve it for future generations. The COINTELPRO story doesn't have a clean ending because the struggle it represents is ongoing. Government surveillance continues, political dissent is still viewed with suspicion by some officials, and the balance between security and freedom remains contested. But the program's exposure and the reforms it sparked show that progress is possible when citizens have the courage to demand it. The 8 citizens who broke into the media FBI office didn't know they would change history when they decided to act on their suspicions about government surveillance. They just knew that democracy required them to take risks to expose the truth. Their legacy reminds us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have the courage to act on their principles. That's the real lesson of COINTELPRO, not that government will always abuse its power, but that citizens have the power to stop that abuse when they decide to act. The program's exposure required illegal action by private citizens, courageous reporting by journalists, and determined investigation by Congress. It required people to risk their careers, their freedom, and their safety to defend democratic principles. The question for each generation is whether it will have the courage to make similar sacrifices when democracy is threatened. The COINTELPRO legacy suggests that the answer depends not on the actions of government officials or political leaders, but on the choices made by ordinary citizens who decide whether they're willing to defend their freedom or surrender it to those who promise to keep them safe. The program's history reminds us that the price of freedom really is eternal vigilance, and that vigilance must be exercised not just against foreign enemies, but against domestic officials who would sacrifice democratic principles for bureaucratic power or political advantage. The same forces that created COINTELPRO continue to exist within government, waiting for the right crisis or justification to reassert themselves. Only an informed and engaged citizenry can prevent the repetition of COINTELPRO's abuses. Only people who understand the program's history and are willing to defend democratic principles can ensure that government surveillance powers aren't again used to suppress political dissent and constitutional rights. The COINTELPRO story is ultimately about the eternal struggle between freedom and authority, between democracy and surveillance, between the rights of citizens and the power of government. That struggle didn't end with the program's exposure, and it won't end with any particular law or reform. It will continue as long as democratic government exists, requiring each generation to choose anew between freedom and security, between transparency and surveillance, between the messy uncertainty of democracy and the false certainty of authoritarian control. The activists who were targeted by COINTELPRO made their choice, and their courage in the face of government persecution helped preserve democratic freedoms for future generations. The citizens who exposed the program made their choice, risking their freedom to defend democracy itself. Now it's our turn to choose, and the legacy of COINTELPRO reminds us that the stakes couldn't be higher. The program's history shows us both the worst and the best of American democracy, the capacity for government abuse and the power of citizens to stop that abuse, the fragility of constitutional rights and the strength of people willing to defend them, the danger of unchecked power, and the possibility of meaningful reform. Which legacy we inherit depends on the choices we make today. The COINTELPRO story reminds us that those choices matter, that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences, and that democracy is only as strong as the citizens willing to defend it. The question isn't whether government will be tempted to abuse its surveillance powers. The question is whether citizens will have the courage to stop that abuse when it occurs. The answer to that question will determine whether the COINTELPRO legacy is a cautionary tale about democracy's fragility or an inspiring example of democracy's resilience. The choice, as always, is ours to make. So there you have it. 4 stories. A coup that fizzled out girls who glowed with poison, a study built on a monstrous lie, and a secret war on thought itself. Pretty wild, huh? The common thread here, if you haven't noticed, is power. The terrifying things that can happen when corporate, scientific, or government power goes unchecked, and when secrecy is used as a weapon against the very people it's supposed to protect. But there's another thread running through these stories, the power of the individual to fight back. A stubborn general who chose integrity over wealth. Dying young women who refused to be silenced even as their bodies were literally falling apart. A government clerk with a conscience who threw away his career to expose medical atrocities. A group of ordinary citizens with crowbars and copying machines who broke into an FBI office because they believed democracy was worth the risk. Each of these secrets was exposed not because the powerful suddenly developed a conscience, but because individuals chose to do the right thing even when it cost them everything. Smedley Butler could have been rich and respected by America's elite, but he chose to be a patriot instead. Grace Fryer could have stayed quiet and died peacefully, but she chose to fight for justice even while her jaw was literally crumbling. Peter Buxton could have kept his head down and enjoyed a comfortable government career, but he chose to speak truth to power. The media burglars could have stayed home and watched TV, but they chose to risk decades in prison to defend democracy. That's what makes these stories both terrifying and inspiring. They show us how easily power can corrupt, how readily institutions can betray their stated purposes, and how quickly democracy can be undermined from within. But they also show us that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they decide to use it. It's easy to look back from our comfortable 21st century couches and judge, but these stories are a reminder of how fragile progress is, how recent many of our protections really are, and how quickly they can disappear if we stop paying attention. The business plot happened less than a century ago. Your grandparents or great-grandparents lived through a time when America's wealthiest men seriously planned to overthrow the democratically elected government. The fact that it seems impossible today is partly because Smedley Butler's courage made such plots harder to imagine, but also because we've forgotten how close we came to losing everything. The Radium girls were fighting for workplace safety. when your great-grandmothers might have been entering the workforce. Every safety regulation in every workplace today exists partly because young women were literally glowing as they died from corporate negligence. OSHA workers' compensation, the right to know about workplace hazards, all of these protections were paid for with the lives of girls who trusted their employers and were betrayed. The Tuskegee study was still active when your parents were born. The idea that doctors need informed consent before experimenting on patients, that medical research requires ethical oversight, that people have a right to know what's being done to their bodies. These seem like obvious principles today, but they had to be established through the suffering of men who were lied to for 40 years. COINTELPRO was destroying lives when the Beatles were topping the charts. The idea that Americans have a right to political dissent without government harassment, that law enforcement agencies need oversight, that surveillance requires warrants. These protections exist because citizens risked everything to expose a program that treated political activism as treason. And honestly, it makes you appreciate your Wi-Fi and your DoorDash, doesn't it? It makes you grateful that for all its flaws, we live in a time when a secret like Tuskegee or COINTELPRO would be leaked on Twitter in about 5 minutes. When corporate malfeasance gets exposed by smartphone videos and viral hashtags. When government corruption gets investigated by armies of citizen journalists with laptops and internet connections. But that technological optimism comes with a warning. The same technologies that make exposure easier also make surveillance more comprehensive, manipulation more sophisticated, and control more subtle. The business plot required raising an actual army. Today's corporate influence operates through lobbying, campaign contributions, and regulatory capture. The Radium girls' employers had to lie to individual workers. Today's corporations can manipulate entire populations through targeted advertising and algorithmic manipulation. Tuskegee required physically lying to specific individuals. Today's medical experimentation can be hidden in the fine print of terms of service agreements that no one reads. COINTELPRO required breaking into offices and planting bugs. Today's surveillance operates through devices we voluntarily carry in our pockets and algorithms that know us better than we know ourselves. The forms change, but the fundamental dynamics remain the same. Power seeks to protect itself, institutions resist accountability, and secrecy enables abuse. The only thing that changes is the sophistication of the methods and the scale of their application. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we honor the sacrifices of the people whose stories we've told tonight? First, we remember that democracy isn't a spectator sport. Every single one of these secrets was exposed because individuals decided to act, not because institutions policed themselves or because the arc of history automatically bent toward justice. Progress requires participation, and participation requires courage. Second, we stay suspicious of official explanations, especially when they come from institutions with something to hide. The business plot conspirators insisted they were patriotic Americans trying to save the country. The Radium companies claimed their product was safe and beneficial. The Tuskegee researchers argued they were advancing medical science. The FBI insisted COINTELPRO was necessary for national security. All of them were lying, and they were lying for the same reason, because the truth would have ended their power to harm people. When institutions tell you to trust them, when they insist that transparency would compromise their effectiveness, when they argue that oversight would prevent them from protecting you, that's exactly when you need to demand transparency and oversight. Third, we support the people who take risks to expose the truth. Whistleblowers, investigative journalists, and activists who challenge powerful institutions deserve our protection and gratitude, not our suspicion and hostility. They're continuing the tradition of Smedley Butler, Grace Fryer, Peter Buxton, and the media burglars, risking everything to defend democracy. Finally, we remember that the price of freedom really is eternal vigilance. Not vigilance against foreign enemies or outside threats, but vigilance against the corruption of our own institutions, the abuse of our own officials, and the erosion of our own rights. The business plot. The Radium Girls, Tuskegee, and COINTELPRO all happened because people stopped paying attention to what was being done in their name. They trusted institutions that didn't deserve trust, believed officials who were lying to them, and assumed that someone else was watching the watchers. Democracy doesn't protect itself. Freedom doesn't preserve itself. Justice doesn't enforce itself. These things require constant effort by ordinary people who decide that defending them is worth the cost. But that's just my take. What do you guys think? Which one of these secrets blew your mind the most? Are there any other buried American stories you think deserve the spotlight? Let me know in the comments below. I actually read them especially during my 3 a.m. insomnia episodes, when I'm wondering whether we've learned anything from these stories, or whether we're doomed to repeat them with better technology and more sophisticated lies. The truth is, I don't know whether these stories represent warnings about what could happen again, or inspiration about what ordinary people can accomplish when they have the courage to act. Maybe they're both. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the real lesson isn't that power corrupts, or that institutions lie, or that democracy is fragile, though all of those things are true. Maybe the real lesson is that none of that matters as long as there are people willing to fight back, willing to risk everything for the truth, willing to choose integrity over safety and justice over comfort. The business plot failed because one man chose country over personal gain. The Radium Girls' suffering led to protections that have saved countless lives because they refused to die quietly. Tuskegee ended because a government employee couldn't live with his knowledge of the lie. COINTELPRO was exposed because 8 citizens decided democracy was worth risking their freedom to defend. These weren't superheroes or saints. They were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and chose to do the right thing even when it cost them everything. They remind us that heroism isn't about superpowers or special abilities. It's about choosing principle over convenience, truth over comfort, and others' welfare over your own safety. In our age of cynicism and apathy, when it's easy to believe that nothing we do matters and that change is impossible, these stories remind us that individuals can make a difference, not because they're special, but because they choose to act when action is needed. The question isn't whether we'll face similar challenges. We already are. The question is whether we'll have the courage to meet them, whether we'll be the ones who expose the next business plot, who fight the next corporate cover-up, who blow the whistle on the next government lie, who break into the next FBI office when democracy needs defending. The choice, as always, is ours to make. Alright, my friends, that's all the unsettling history I have for you tonight. Thanks for hanging out with me and diving into the deep end of America's buried secrets. Thanks for caring enough about the truth to spend your evening learning about things that powerful people hoped you'd never discover. Until next time, stay curious, question everything, and remember that democracy isn't something that happens to you. It's something you participate in, something you defend, something you fight for when necessary, and try to get some sleep. Though after everything we've talked about tonight, that might be easier said than done.